A $33 billion empire. 4 ambitious siblings. And one patriarch who refused to let go. What followed would tear the Whitfields apart. For decades, the Whitfield name was synonymous with power. From their headquarters in Manhattan, Whitfield Global dominated newspapers, television, and digital media across the world. At its helm was Charles Whitfield, a man whose vision had transformed a modest publishing venture into a global empire worth tens of billions. To the outside world, the Whitfields seemed untouchable, a dynasty of wealth and prestige that could weather any storm. But behind closed doors, a very different story was unfolding. Charles's children had grown up surrounded by privilege, groomed from an early age to take their place in the family empire. Yet as they grew older, what was meant to be a legacy of unity became a breeding ground for rivalry. Each child saw themselves as the rightful heir. Each believed they understood the empire better than the others. And each one was determined to claim the throne their father refused to relinquish. It was a recipe for disaster, a fortune too large to divide, a patriarch unwilling to step aside, and siblings who saw one another not as family, but as obstacles. The question wasn't whether a war would erupt, it was only a matter of when. And it all began with the rise of Charles Whitfield, the man who built an empire so vast, yet left his family fractured in its shadow. Before we dive deeper into how Charles Whitfield built his $33 billion empire, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got more unbelievable real-life family sagas just like this one, and you won't want to miss what comes next in the Whitfield feud. Charles Whitfield's story began far from the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Born in the 1930s to a modest family in Melbourne, Australia, Charles had an eye for opportunity from the very start. At just 21, he inherited a small regional newspaper after his father's sudden passing. Most expected him to sell it off. Instead, Charles turned it into the foundation of an empire. Through aggressive expansion, calculated risks, and a relentless pursuit of influence, Whitfield grew his holdings from local print papers into a sprawling media network. By the 1980s, Whitfield Global controlled newspapers across continents, owned television networks in multiple countries, and was pushing into Hollywood film and satellite broadcasting. His charisma, his ability to read markets, and his unshakable confidence made him not just a businessman, but a power broker. Politicians courted his approval, rivals feared his reach, and his name carried weight in every major financial hub. But behind his commanding public image, Charles's personal life was just as complex. He married 3 times. His first marriage gave him his eldest son, Richard, serious, disciplined, but often overshadowed by his father's towering presence. His second marriage produced twins, Daniel and Catherine, fiercely intelligent, yet opposites in temperament. And with his third wife came Michael, the youngest, and by many accounts, Charles's favorite. From the beginning, Charles blurred the line between family and business. He brought his children into meetings as teenagers, exposed them to boardroom politics, and made it clear that one day, the empire would be theirs. But instead of uniting them, this upbringing sowed division. Richard saw himself as the natural successor. Daniel believed his creativity gave him the edge. Catherine resented being underestimated in a male-dominated empire. And Michael, the youngest, relied on his closeness to their father as proof of his claim. Even in their 20s, rivalries began to surface, snide remarks at family dinners, sharp elbows in business discussions, quiet campaigns for their father's approval. Charles encouraged competition, convinced it would prepare them for leadership. What he didn't realize was that he was laying the foundation for a war that would one day consume them all. Because if Charles Whitfield built Whitfield Global on ambition, he also unknowingly built a family legacy of conflict. And as his empire grew larger, so did the cracks forming inside his own home. But as Charles expanded his empire and pulled his children deeper into its orbit, something darker began to take root. What started as quiet competition between siblings soon sharpened into open resentment. Every dinner table became a negotiation, every boardroom a battlefield in waiting. And when Charles made one calculated decision about who would lead next, it set off the first spark that would ignite a war inside the Whitfield family. Inside the Whitfield family, each child carried both privilege and pressure. From the outside, they looked like heirs to a kingdom. But within the family walls, every one of them felt they had something to prove. Richard, the eldest, carried the weight of responsibility from an early age. Disciplined and calculated, he believed the role of successor naturally belonged to him. He spent decades inside the company, learning every detail, from distribution chains to advertising strategy. But while Richard saw himself as the rightful heir, his siblings saw something else, an overbearing brother who acted entitled to power that was never promised. Daniel, one of the twins, was his opposite. Ambitious and ruthless, Daniel excelled in deal-making. He thrived in negotiations, often pushing riskier strategies that alarmed his more conservative brother. Yet despite his talent, Daniel always felt overlooked by their father, a man who admired caution over recklessness. That resentment hardened over time, leaving Daniel determined to take the throne by force if needed. Catherine, Daniel's twin, brought a different energy altogether. Sharp, articulate, and deeply knowledgeable, she was often dismissed in the early years of the business, both for being a woman in a male-dominated empire and for not fitting her father's mold of a successor. But Catherine was no bystander. She built her own alliances, quietly influencing board members, journalists, and even political figures. She played a slower game, but a smarter one. Then there was Michael, the youngest. Raised during Charles's later years, Michael was widely seen as the favorite. While his older siblings fought for approval, Michael had something they didn't: his father's trust. Charles often praised his instincts, gave him responsibilities others thought he hadn't earned, and positioned him close to his side. For Richard, Daniel, and Catherine, this favoritism wasn't just irritating. It was threatening. Over the years, cracks widened into confrontations. Richard and Daniel clashed openly in boardrooms. Catherine leaked stories to the press that undermined her brother's reputations. Michael lobbied behind the scenes, always with his father's backing. Each child claimed loyalty to the family empire, but in reality, they were preparing for battle. Stories like this show just how far families will go when billions are at stake. If you're finding this saga as gripping as we are, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. We've got more explosive real-life family dramas coming your way, and the Whitfield feud is only just heating up. The rivalries that had once simmered in whispers were now boiling over in public view. Every move was strategic, every gesture loaded with meaning. And when Charles suddenly fell ill, those rivalries exploded into something far more dangerous, an all-out war for control of Whitfield Global. By the late 1990s, Charles Whitfield's health began to falter. Once a commanding figure who could dominate a room with his presence, he now appeared frail, his energy drained by age and recurring bouts of illness. For the first time, whispers about succession were no longer hypothetical, they were urgent. Inside Whitfield Global, executives and investors grew restless. Everyone wanted to know who would take the reins of the $33 billion empire. Would Charles step aside gracefully and appoint a successor, or cling to control as long as possible? True to form, Charles refused to give anyone a clear answer. His refusal created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed his children. Richard, the eldest, assumed that the mantle would naturally fall to him. He began positioning himself publicly as the heir, reassuring board members and longtime allies that stability was guaranteed under his leadership. Michael, the youngest and his father's favorite, quickly aligned with him, believing that together, they could secure their father's blessing and lock the others out. Daniel and Catherine, however, saw things differently. Daniel believed Richard's cautious style would doom the company's future. Catherine, long underestimated, viewed both brothers as unfit to lead. The two began forging a quiet alliance of their own, reaching out to shareholders and allies in the press to undermine Richard's authority and question Michael's experience. Soon, the conflict spilled out of the family's private walls. Stories appeared in tabloids about boardroom infighting. Anonymous sources leaked details of screaming matches between siblings. Lawsuits began circulating over alleged breaches of fiduciary duty. For a company that thrived on controlling narratives, the Whitfields suddenly found themselves at the mercy of a media storm, ironically, a storm created within their own empire. The fights were no longer just about strategy, they were about identity, legitimacy, and legacy. Each sibling was convinced they alone understood what their father had built, and each feared being left behind. Charles, meanwhile, seemed to relish keeping them guessing. He would praise one child in the morning and another by nightfall, playing them off one another as if the battle itself was a test. But as the empire trembled under the weight of uncertainty, one dramatic move from Charles would escalate the feud from family squabble to full-scale war. By the early 2000s, the Whitfield feud was no longer a private struggle contained within family walls. It was a public spectacle, played out across headlines, television panels, and corporate boardrooms. What had begun as quiet jockeying for position turned into open warfare. The boardroom became the primary battleground. Richard, backed by his younger brother Michael, attempted to consolidate control. He introduced proposals aimed at cementing his authority, including a succession framework that placed him as acting chairman. But Daniel and Catherine fought back with equal force. They lobbied directors, staged walkouts, and threatened to pull their shares unless Richard's plan was scrapped. Meetings that once revolved around quarterly earnings now dissolved into shouting matches, with siblings undermining one another in front of stunned executives. Leaked emails added fuel to the fire. A series of internal messages found their way to the press, revealing just how deeply divided the family had become. One leak suggested Richard had described Daniel as reckless and dangerous. Another hinted that Catherine privately believed Michael was woefully unqualified and was only in the conversation because of favoritism. Each revelation deepened the distrust and humiliated the Whitfields on a global stage. Strategic firings followed. Allies loyal to one sibling were suddenly removed by another. Key executives who picked the wrong side found themselves out of a job within weeks. Every move became a signal of shifting power. The company wasn't just bleeding stability, it was bleeding credibility. Family dinners, once rare chances for reconciliation, turned into live combat zones. Arguments erupted over everything from business strategy to childhood grievances. At one particularly infamous gathering, Catherine accused Richard of caring more about control than legacy, while Richard fired back that she was using the press to destroy the very empire their father had built. Michael sat silently by their father's side, while Daniel stormed out, vowing he'd rather burn the company down than see Richard in charge. Bitter accusations defined this period. Greed, betrayal, disloyalty, each sibling hurled the words at one another, never seeing their own reflection in them. To outsiders, it looked like a family unraveling in real time. To the Whitfields, it felt like a war that none of them could afford to lose. The media, ironically much of it controlled by Whitfield Global's competitors, had a field day. Headlines described the implosion of America's most powerful media dynasty. Editorials speculated about how long the company could survive under such dysfunction. Late-night comedians mocked the family feud as if it were a soap opera. For Charles Whitfield, who had spent a lifetime controlling narratives, it was an unbearable humiliation. If this story has you hooked, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover more real-life sagas where money, power, and family collide, and trust me, the Whitfield War is only going to get uglier from here. The company's stock began to slide. Shareholders demanded answers. Rival firms circled like sharks, hoping to exploit the chaos. Inside the empire, no one trusted anyone else. What had once been a dynasty of dominance was now consumed by paranoia, betrayal, and backstabbing. And then, just when it seemed the Whitfields had reached rock bottom, Charles himself re-entered the fight, with a decision that would shock not just his children, but the entire business world. By 2007, pressure on Charles Whitfield had reached its peak. The empire he built was rattled by infighting, shareholder unrest, and relentless media coverage of his family's dysfunction. Many expected him to finally resolve the issue by naming a clear successor. But true to character, Charles had one final card to play, a move that would stun his children and the business world alike. In a carefully orchestrated announcement, Charles revealed that he had no intention of handing Whitfield Global entirely to any one child. Instead, he unveiled a structure that split authority. Richard and Michael, his eldest and youngest, would share oversight of the company's American assets. Daniel and Catherine would control the international division. Final approval, however, would remain with Charles himself until he formally stepped down. To outsiders, it looked like a compromise. To the Whitfields, it was a declaration of war. The split all but guaranteed further conflict. Decisions now required cooperation across deeply fractured lines, and every vote became a stalemate. Board members watched in disbelief as siblings vetoed one another's proposals, stalling progress on billion-dollar projects. Behind closed doors, the reaction was even more volatile. Richard fumed that decades of loyalty had been rewarded with only partial control. Daniel seethed at being tethered to his sister, convinced she would block his every move. Catherine, who had worked tirelessly to be taken seriously, felt manipulated, used as a counterweight rather than recognized as a leader in her own right. And Michael, long assumed to be the chosen favorite, realized that even he had been undercut. The sense of betrayal wasn't just directed at each other. For the first time, the siblings turned their anger toward their father. They accused him of stringing them along, of deliberately feeding rivalries to maintain control, of caring more about power than the family itself. Charles listened but remained unmoved. To him, the struggle was proof that none of them were ready to lead alone. Then came the final blow. Within a year of the new structure, Charles Whitfield announced his formal retirement, retreating into private life as his health declined. Without his iron grip, the fragile arrangement collapsed almost immediately. Each faction acted independently, pursuing separate agendas and undermining the other's decisions. Shareholders grew panicked. Rivals smelled opportunity. The empire, once singular and unstoppable, looked fractured beyond repair. And as Charles's health took a final turn for the worse, the siblings realized they were running out of time. The patriarch who had defined their lives was slipping away, and with him, the last thread holding the empire together. What came next wasn't just about succession. It was about survival. When Charles Whitfield finally passed away, the empire he had built over 6 decades stood on the verge of collapse. Without his presence to keep the siblings in check, Whitfield Global descended into chaos. The split control structure that Charles left behind proved unworkable. Richard and Michael clashed over the American operations, disagreeing on everything from programming strategy to acquisitions. Daniel and Catherine, running the international division, quickly fell apart as allies, each accusing the other of sabotage. What had been designed as a system of balance turned into open paralysis. The financial cost was staggering. Court filings revealed billions drained in legal fees as the siblings launched lawsuits against one another, challenging boardroom decisions, inheritance claims, and trust structures. Investors fled as the company's stock price plummeted. Advertisers, wary of being associated with instability, pulled out of key contracts. Within a decade, Whitfield Global had lost nearly a third of its market value. The damage extended beyond business. The Whitfield siblings' personal relationships shattered beyond repair. They stopped appearing together in public, birthdays and holidays went unacknowledged, and family events were marked by absences rather than unity. What began as a battle for control of a company ended as the complete destruction of a family. Public reaction was divided. Some blamed the siblings, pointing to their greed and ambition as the reason a dynasty fell apart. Others blamed Charles himself, arguing that his refusal to name a successor, and his habit of pitting his children against each other, had set the stage for inevitable disaster. Either way, the once gilded Whitfield name, long synonymous with wealth and power, became shorthand for dysfunction. For a family that had built its empire on controlling narratives, the final irony was brutal. Their own story was now one of betrayal, bitterness, and broken legacy. The empire still existed, but it was fractured, weakened, and overshadowed by the scandal of its own making. And yet, even as the Whitfields retreated from the spotlight, the questions lingered. Could any of them repair the damage? Or was the dynasty that Charles Whitfield built destined to crumble completely in the hands of his children? The Whitfield feud wasn't just about money. It was about power, pride, and the wounds only family can inflict. For decades, Charles Whitfield stood as the symbol of ambition fulfilled, an immigrant son who built a $33 billion empire from a single newspaper. Yet in trying to preserve his legacy, he created a battlefield where his children became rivals instead of heirs. The siblings' war was never truly about strategy or vision. It was about validation, favoritism, and the scars left by a father who pushed competition above unity. Each believed they were fighting for the empire, but in the end, they destroyed the very thing they sought to protect. The legacy of Whitfield Global remains, but it is a shadow of its former self. What was once admired as an unstoppable dynasty is now remembered as a cautionary tale. For some, it is proof that unchecked ambition will consume everything in its path. For others, it is a reminder that even the most powerful families cannot escape the consequences of their own dysfunction. So the question lingers, if $33 billion couldn't hold the Whitfields together, what chance does love have against greed? As the world looks back on Charles Whitfield's empire, once mighty, now scarred forever, it stands as both an extraordinary achievement and a tragic warning. Dynasties may rise on ambition, but more often than not, they fall on pride. If you found the Whitfield saga as gripping as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We share more true stories where wealth, power, and family collide, and trust me, you won't want to miss the next one.